Hello, welcome to episode number 3 of Conversations with a Coach. And today my guest is a wonderful human who I was introduced to, it must be a good 2 years ago now, 18 months, 2 years ago. It must be something like that. She's an incredible human. Her name is Vicki Shevlin, and she is a frontline child protection social worker. And she educates people within the social work space. Now, this podcast, as I've said before, is about creativity, it's about curiosity, it's about connection, and it's about communication. And I think that the job that Vicki does encompasses communication and connection at its very core. So thank you for coming and agreeing to be on my podcast today, Vicki. It's super exciting to have you here.
Thank you for having me. That was a nice
very welcome. So let's get straight into this and tell me, how would you define the work that you do?
So I can give the sort of jobby explanation and then my own definition, but I am a qualified social worker. I have worked in the UK, in England, and I've always worked in frontline child protection teams. So that means I work for the local authority within the statutory service. So I've always done frontline child protection, and more recently moved into a different role, which is still in safeguarding child protection, but a little bit less front facing. And the job that I do in terms of social work, or have done in terms of social work, is amazing. It's privileged, but it's also extremely hard and demanding and challenging, and I like all those parts of it. But I suppose for social workers work across a variety of different areas, and my specialism is just with children and families and child protection. But I would say for most social workers at the moment who are working in that area, there's a struggle between what's going on within local government and there's always a balance between the different systems that are interlinked around it, to be honest.
Yeah, I imagine it's the systems is the thing that can almost be the bone of contention, I guess, that can hold things up, that can blur lines, that create barriers and create miscommunications. So if all of the systems that you have to operate within are not coherent, cohesive, consistent, it can cause all sorts of different problems. Why and when did you choose social work for your career?
So the why is probably because I'd always volunteered and worked with people through being a teenager, I suppose. And then I did an undergraduate degree in drama and theatre arts, which some people think, oh, how did you go from that into social work? But that was about creativity and connection. And I focused my degree in working or focusing on community theatre. And so when I graduated, I had 2 jobs. I had one job was working in a community theatre company that worked with adults affected by homelessness. So we were based in a hostel in the north of England, and that was amazing. And we used to run workshops for any of the adults who wanted to access them, which again taught me a lot about communication and interaction and group dynamics and how that impacted things, but also about the systemic poverty and the impact of that, because there'd be days when we couldn't do what we wanted to do because actually somebody just needed to have their basic needs met, and they needed a shower and they needed food, and that was what was important at that time. And then there were other days where you had a group of people who were so impacted, they might have had a night when they were sleeping rough and they might not know where they're going to sleep tonight, but actually for an hour they could be other people and they can let go and they can improvise and they can express themselves in different ways, and that was really powerful. And then alongside that, I had a few different jobs all in sort of care work, and the main one, I worked with adults with severe and profound learning difficulties and physical disabilities and life-limiting illnesses. And that was in a residential care setting and a nursing home. And I loved that. It was amazing. And that was such a privileged job as well. And I think I got from that what it truly means to care for somebody in terms of providing their physical care from the minute that they wake up to the minute that they go to bed and then through the night. So at that point, after I'd worked in both those jobs, I knew I wanted to take it further and I wasn't quite sure how, and social work felt like the next step for me. So yeah, that was probably the why and the when. And then I did a master's degree in social work, which at the time the NHS provided bursaries to do, which is significant in terms of social work because the landscape of how people can access the qualification is changing. And I was fortunate that at the time I could get a bursary, which made it possible for me to do the masters. And when you do social work masters, you do it's 2 years and you do 2 placements. So one is, I can't even remember now, one is 90 days and one is 100 days or 120 days, can't quite remember. But the final placement that I did was in a Frontline child protection team. And then that's sort of the first job that I applied for to do my first year qualification, and then stayed in it.
It's amazing. It must take a certain type of person to want to become a social worker in the first place, but to be exposed to the true hardships and the pain and the devastation and destruction of families, it has to really take a certain type of person to be able to deal with that. What qualities do you think, what do you need to be a good social worker? What makes a good social worker?
Oh, I would say empathy is the first one. They're probably not going to be in any particular order because it's probably a balance of lots of different qualities, but empathy means that you can hold space for any of the people that you're working with. So when we're looking at children and families who are in difficulty, it's about being able to hold empathy for the adults as well as the children, because they were children once as well, and that's a really difficult balance to try and find, particularly when we're in safeguarding. Perspective, I would say, because you have to be able to step back and look at those wider systems I was talking about. So people don't just exist in a vacuum. There is a connection and correlation between people living in poverty and people who have social care intervening in their lives without sort of against what they want, I suppose. So that perspective, I think, is really important to practice within the current or within the current climate in the UK, really. Care, which is a kind of nuanced word, and it's used a lot when we're talking about social work, and it's misused sometimes. It's used when there maybe isn't care, but actually wanting the best for people. And I suppose resilience, I don't know if that's a quality or something that you develop, but being able to keep going day after day, it takes a lot of resilience. There is quite a high burnout rate, particularly in terms of frontline child protection, and that's because of lots of different factors. But yeah, there's lots of different qualities, I would say. And then alongside that, there's skills that can be taught, but maybe aren't always taught. And that's what I try and do with Social Work Sorted, really, is to find the gap between them and try and hone in on those skills, because you can have the qualities, but if no one's taught you how to do certain things or you haven't seen someone else do it, that's when I find particularly new social workers start to struggle a little bit.
So we've mentioned the systems a couple of times now. It's probably a good idea that we clarify what those systems might be for people that are listening. So what are the systems that you need to be operating within, so the family systems and the outside organisations? So can you explain a little bit about those systems and how they can impact and why you need to be super conscious of them?
Yeah, so, and I suppose that comes from, within one of my roles, I was fortunate to do some introductory training in systemic family therapy, and there's lots of information about systems theory that people can look at, but it's essentially what we operate within. So there's kind of international systems in terms of what's happening with the world, with, you know, for example, climate change, migration across continents, all those things impact us. Then you sort of go in another level in terms of what's happening in, I guess, in the country, in terms of government, politics, policies that come from that. You would then go in another level and you might look at the systems, I suppose the next level of systems that might be around a child, for example, if we're using it, that would be the different public services that they might have access to. The next might be the people that are around them, and in terms of their immediate family. And it sort of, when you look at things like eco maps or systems, it's circles inside circles, and in the very middle would be the child or would be the person. So yeah, I suppose a lot of the time when I'm talking about systems with social work, I'm talking about political structures and policies that directly impact people. For example, austerity would be the biggest one at the moment, I guess.
Do you think that,
and
with
then,
that in mind, the cost of living crisis that we know is imminent and gathering speed right now, that's going to impact the work that you do, right?
Yeah, and has been impacting over the past 10 years, really. And it's hitting even harder now, post-pandemic, if we are even post-pandemic, in terms of where people's mental health is at because of 2 years of lockdowns and everything that followed after that. And yeah, the people who are in work are going to food banks. As we know, it's not just people, which government or media might try and want people to believe, that are accessing universal credit. If people are accessing universal credit, there should be no stigma around that anyway. But yeah, certainly I'm finding it's twofold, because it's negatively affecting the people that we are working with who are coming into contact with services. It's also impacting social workers themselves. It's impacting people who want to access the profession, because there's a disparity in terms of how people can access in terms of funding. And like I said, the bursaries that I was fortunate to have aren't happening anymore. And I suppose in terms of the wider climate, there's reasons that people come into contact with social services. We used to have a bigger early help provision than we currently have now nationally. So where people might have needed support, they would have got that. But what happens currently, or more commonly, is that social work becomes reactive and intervention happens at crisis point rather than early on, which means that we're not able to support families as they need. And probably when we're going in at crisis point, things escalate. Whereas if there were early intervention services, that probably wouldn't happen.
Because social work gets a bad rap in the media, and there's been stories in the past about mistakes that have been made. That, I imagine, comes down to the early intervention stuff, but also funding and burnout. The work that you have to do as social workers is emotionally, energetically draining. And you mentioned it already, that the level of burnout that social workers are dealing with, all of these things impact on the job that you're trying to do. So can you, in as much as you can, really, I guess, can you talk us through what, being on the front line of child protection, how does this affect you? Like, what do you have to go through? And the burnout is obvious when people realise what you do. Can you explain that for people, so that they really, I want people to listen to this and have a fresh perspective of the idea of social workers and the work that they have to do. So can you explain a little bit about how it impacts people like you and the impact that then has on...
I'm thinking how cheery this is. But it's, you know what, it's a hard job, and it's nice to come on and talk, because usually I'm talking to social workers who already know, and it's interesting to switch it in terms of for somebody who might not really have an idea. But for social workers at the moment, the I think the average caseload changes, but you could be responsible for as many as 30 children. Sometimes social workers, where we look at serious case reviews, might have been responsible for way more than that. So those children might be within, there might be a certain number of families, and there might be a certain number of children that you're responsible for. When you're responsible for a child, you have a statutory responsibility to see that child, to see them at home, to see them alone if you have consent, sometimes to see them at school, to complete work with them around their lives so you understand their wishes and their feelings and their views. You have a responsibility to manage the multidisciplinary group around a child, because there's rarely just a social worker. There might be health services, there might be educational services, there might be additional support services, there could be housing, there might be police or probation, depending on what the case is. So you are responsible for holding multi-agency meetings, which might happen every 4 weeks or every 6 weeks. You are responsible for implementing plans that are in place. You're responsible for risk assessing, for making sure that you can provide a sound analysis of where risk has escalated or where risk is minimised. You're responsible for, I suppose, managing what it means day to day for families who are struggling. So that would be an influx of phone calls, emails, reports to write. Everything that you do has to be recorded on internal systems, and those recordings have to be really accurate. They have to have analysis, they have to have clear times, they have to have clear dates. If things escalate and you're responsible for going into care proceedings, you have a mountain of paperwork that you have to complete. You're responsible for all those tasks, but then it's the emotional burden of the kind of personal and human responsibilities that you might have a child on your caseload who you know to be experiencing risk or harm regularly. So it's crisis management. Like I said before, a lot of what we're doing is having to be reactive. Crisis management to in terms of emergencies, you might have to support somebody to be rehomed if they've been assaulted in a domestic abuse incident. You might be responsible for making sure that a child is seen after they might have alleged somebody's physically assaulted them. They might have to go from a child protection medical. So all these, alongside all the day-to-day tasks that you're doing and ongoing management, you're responding to crisis all the time. And teams work in very different ways. So some teams might just work on they might be called duty and assessment, where you would, all the incoming referrals, anyone can refer into social care, would be screened, and then you would have to go out on the day if there was anything sort of an emergency and complete an initial assessment. You could be in a longer term team where you hold cases that are on child protection plans. You might be in a team that manages care proceedings when we're working within a legal remit, and some teams hold all those things at the same time. So it's then trying to manage all those things at once. And when you have a number of children that you're responsible for at the same time, it's impossible to then keep up with everything that you want to do and then be able to provide, because what social workers really want to do is sit and be with families so you can do the work with them. And when I have been a social worker, I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that and have the time and space to do that and prioritise that, because I was allowed to do that as a newly qualified social worker because of where I worked, and then was able to, I suppose I had the skills that meant I could go in within a certain amount of time and do a piece of direct work with a child or a family that would be really useful and help in terms of assessing, but also help in terms of an intervention with them. But for social workers who've been qualified in a pandemic, because all they've ever known is reactive and going in at crisis point and not physically being able to sit down with a child because of social distancing and gaps, we're currently dealing with issues because of that as well. And, you know, you mentioned lots of serious case reviews in the media. COVID had a huge impact on the work that we were doing as social workers, because there was guidance about whether you could visit or not visit. Social workers were visiting throughout the pandemic with or without PPE. I know that they were, because that's, you know, all public services were just doing everything that they could. but it certainly meant that things were missed. And yeah, there's lots of reasons behind that. No social worker is responsible when a child is seriously harmed or hurt. It's the person who's harmed or hurt them that's responsible. But social care, like all public services, have a responsibility as well. But then that's also when you need to consider the wider systems that are impacting them. And yeah, when you're trying to keep up with all those things and balance all those plates, but you also have the emotional burden of, I am the person responsible for this child, and it might be a child and family that you really care about and that you've built up a relationship with, but things might not be going okay. You then have to tell them you're entering into care proceedings, or that they need to do a certain thing that they don't want to do. It's very taxing. And I know that one suggestion is lowering caseloads and funding early help services. And I think that would definitely release the burden, but I think there would always be a level of an emotional burden because you're working with humans and human relationships and connections. So, but there's definitely lots of things that make that worse or more extreme. Do you think that, I suppose.
Are there enough people training to become social workers? Is there a gap in recruitment?
I think, yeah, there's a definite gap in recruitment, and it's currently being filled by agency employment. So there's a massive disparity at the moment in the sector because there's no local authorities have no choice but to recruit agency staff members, which obviously come at a much higher cost. So you might have social workers in a team getting paid a certain amount, and they know that the person from the agency is getting paid a lot more, and that can be very difficult. I don't know in terms of the stats, I probably should know of people entering into the profession. There's lots of different routes that people can now enter, and some of those they're all very different, but it's no longer just through a university degree, which again is a difficult topic within the social work sector in terms of funding and where that leaves social work, and the access that people, particularly people who are experts by experience, who might have been through social care systems for different reasons, and I suppose Black, Brown, global majority individuals, that it becomes disproportionate in terms of who can access the courses and the qualifications to be a social worker. And then that means that the social workers who are going out are not going to have that lived experience that someone
that was something else I was going to ask you about, the accessibility to become qualified as a social worker. There's a gap in the social mobility aspect, I guess, is that people who potentially have gone through the care system themselves, who then want to actually become social workers and make a difference, won't be able to, because it's impossible to self-fund a university degree. It's impossible. My son's in university right now, and I know how expensive it is. So that in itself, changes need to happen with accessibility to education, to further education, to give equality, I guess, the diversity of workers, the diversity of leadership teams, to share their lived experience, to make the interventions more impactful, more powerful, and to create stronger change from that perspective. When you're dealing with families in that highly emotive container, how do you cope in that situation? So telling a parent that you have to remove their child to put them through the care system, or giving bad news, or having to be part of an organisation where things are falling down. How do you cope with that? And how are you helping other social workers through Social Work Sorted to manage that emotional load?
Yeah, I think in terms of delivering bad news to people, which is often what social workers have to do. It's about communicating things verbally in a way that people understand, because when people are in crisis, they might not hear absolutely everything. So then it's about your delivery in terms of being extremely calm and trying to manage a situation by or through your body language and your tone of voice, and making sure that nothing you do in terms of where you position your body escalates things. I suppose in terms of talking about care proceedings, because if a child, in most situations, unless it's an emergency situation or crisis situation, care proceedings would mean that you would have to go to court to get an order before a child would then move out of their home into a foster home or a placement. Those things, I had training when I first started, and part of the training there was a slide and it said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it. I think it was like Einstein who said it. And that's always stuck with me in terms of the way that I explain things to children and to families, that the knowledge that I might be within something and I might understand what I'm talking about, but that's because I'm dealing with this every single day. And it's about taking it back and not patronizing people, but just explaining things in a way that people understand. And often, if you reflect on a situation or a scenario, a lot of the difficulty in communication, a lot of the conflict will come from miscommunication and a lack of understanding, and people not quite understanding processes, or people not explaining things properly to a family. So I always find that's a really good first step, and it sounds really simple, but actually there's a lot of times when that doesn't happen. And then if that's not dealt with, then it escalates, I suppose. And then I guess with Social Work Sorted, I'm trying to do a similar thing. So break things down for people, or break down ideas or skills or scenarios for new social workers into more digestible steps, because there's a realm of research and theory that social workers need to access and listen to underpin the work that we're doing. But for me, I know that newly qualified social workers who are working under all those conditions that I just talked about, sometimes they just don't have time. And I wanted to create something that they can access and go on their phone and flick through and just think, okay, that's just actually reminded me that I can stay a little bit calm before I knock on this door to go on this home visit, and I can understand that there is a whole world inside that home that I'm not a part of and I don't understand, and I need to be respectful of that. And I suppose, again, in terms of delivering bad news to people or having difficult conversations, it's about being respectful and never coming from the position that you are the expert, because you might see somebody for an hour in a week of their entire lives. So we might draw conclusions about what's happening based on what we know, based on information from other people. But if we're not listening to the person, then relationships are going to break down. And listening is about really listening and hearing and understanding and saying, I don't agree with you, but I respect what you're saying. And people can see through that very quickly, regardless of where they're from or what they're going through. And children can see through that quicker than most, and teenagers can see through it even faster. So I think being respectful and trying as much as possible not to judge, which I know that a regular complaint of people who are maybe subject to social work intervention would be that they feel judged. And that's really difficult, because
it's a judgment.
An assessment is just that. It's, how is this person parenting? So parents feel like, you are judging me. But being really open with people and trying to show that you're human too, and that you understand all those systems that are surrounding them, and explaining what your job is and what the law says, and just trying to be as transparent as possible. And I think sometimes, because they're difficult conversations to have, it's more likely that people will avoid those conversations. And by avoiding those conversations, they leave big questions for the families that they're working with, and that breaks down barrier after barrier. So, but there's so many things that
hard
that
conversations.
But,
I think when people avoid the hard conversations, like you just said, there's gaps. There's gaps in information, but the connection doesn't happen, because it's only through hard conversation and through that shared vulnerability that you truly get the measure of somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And just saying, this is going to be a hard conversation, or I'm about to say something really difficult and I'm going to find it difficult to say because I really care about your family and what happens for you. And I know that it's not easy. Saying that, I know that you're not going to trust me because you've had really bad experience with social workers in the past. I know that what I say you disagree with, and I know it's really difficult for me to, or for you to let me back in your home because it's such a personal space. I've had parents where I have been through care proceedings and some of their children aren't living with them because of care proceedings, because of evidence I've given. I know it wasn't safe for those children to be there, but it doesn't mean that that's an easy decision to make. And then those parents have to let me back into their home. And the power dynamic there is really, really difficult. But for someone to be able to do that and talk to somebody and be calm and have that conversation, it's amazing. I think not just ignoring that, just calling that out for what it is. And if there is saying there's a really difficult power dynamic, that I'm a social worker and you're afraid of social care, just being transparent about it, I suppose.
As social workers who go through this incredibly intense emotional experience, are you offered therapy as part of what you do, or are you recommended therapy or counselling? No,
absolutely not. I don't know of any public sectors that are giving people access to therapy. So social workers have to have supervision, and supervision would be like a one-to-one with a manager. It's intended to be a review of you and how you are, but also your cases, as you call them, but the children and families that you're working with. And I think sometimes what happens for social workers is it just becomes or in the worst case scenario, supervision would be, let's look at your cases, what's going on, what do you need to do, who have you seen, when have you seen them? And it just feeds into this sort of tick box environment. And even supervision, which might be, I'm really struggling, there might be some solutions to that, but it's certainly not therapy and not counselling. And I think some local authorities offer that to social workers if they are finding things difficult, maybe if they've gone off sick because of stress, part of their return, but it's definitely not something that is widely available or widely accessed.
I was just going to say that offering therapy if somebody's off sick with depression is a reactionary solution to a problem that it's got to be an endemic problem within. So even having a list of recommended therapists that you can have access to but pay for yourself would be a great start, maybe.
Yeah, and I suppose it then comes back to the cost of that in terms of people having to finance that themselves with everything else. And it would probably be something that you couldn't access within your work time. Some social workers who would access it in their work time, it would then mean that they were left with that for the rest of their day. And that's not exclusive to social workers, nurses, people in education.
So social workers, your wage isn't anything to be shouting about. Would that be fair to say that the pay scale isn't reflective of the emotional mental load required?
No, I don't think it is. However, I think that's the case probably for everyone in the public sector. And I think it's difficult because there's differences in terms of local authorities and what the pay scale is. And I'm conscious of saying that because I think, there's so many people who are, because they see it every day, people who are significantly impacted and can't find a job and don't have a job. So, there are benefits to being a social worker and working within the local authority, or no one would do it at all. But I think it's the same for public services that, but I think making people feel valued isn't always about financial gain. And I think if social workers felt valued in other areas and people in public sectors maybe felt valued in other areas, then the financial benefit wouldn't maybe seem as big. But
so if we didn't have social workers, what would the impact be on our communities?
It's funny because as much as you would see the negatives and when things go wrong, the thing with social work is we never share when things go right. I don't know if like rights and raps are correct word, impact. But you know, when a family have made the positives, like when a family make really positive changes and you see things really improve for a child or a young person, or you see a child or a young person in a place of safety and thriving, or you see them as a family thriving, those are the things that you don't see. And I think if we didn't have social workers, there would be a lot more children and young people experiencing harm and not getting support for it. I can't say that social work is stopping that, and I don't think that's because of individual social workers. I think it's the wider context that's impacting that. But there are social workers intervening currently where it is absolutely necessary to prevent harm from happening to children. And if there were no social workers, that would disappear. But there's also social workers who are working it with adults, might be adults with mental health difficulties, it might be older adults. There are children who are in the care system who have social workers. There's lots of different ways that social workers are supporting, and I think often that's the thing, it's quite invisible, and sometimes a social worker's success might be in the tiniest little moment. It might be that someone's gone to school and had a really good day, or it might be that someone rings you up when they're having a bad time instead of not doing anything. So our successes, the ones that I would say social workers really value the most, might not be these big massive changes. It might just be these tiny little moments, really.
Yeah,
and they're quite hard to measure.
Qualitative versus quantitative stuff, isn't it? I don't think that many people realise that Brené Brown, like my ultimate mentor and guru, but she doesn't know that. I don't think people are always aware that she started out as a social worker, and she's still very much heavily involved in social work in the United States. Is Brené Brown somebody that you look up to or look to for guidance around empathy and compassion and things like that?
Yeah, I'm at your level of obsession, I would say, with Brené Brown. It's funny because I'm really interested in as well how social work is different in the US, because it is different, and social workers in the US would equally be called a therapist, whereas we would never be called, unless we were qualified as a therapist here. So it's really interesting, the difference. There are a lot of similarities, because I have probably, it's like 50-50 followers in terms of mine, which is US and UK, and so there are social workers in the US who are working in child welfare, it would be called over there. But I think Brené Brown's amazing. I love how accessible what she writes is, and how obvious it seems when she says it, but it's not something you would have ever thought of before. And I think so many things that she says stay with me, and we could probably just gush about her all day. I think it's about assuming that someone is doing their best, and taking that stance is so helpful, and it's a really good reminder, and it really kind of grounds and helps when you are working with a family and you might feel really blinkered by some initial pieces of information that you get, just knowing that everyone's doing their best, really. And then as a social worker, for social workers to remember that as well, that they can only do their best, and they're only one person in a massive sort of spider web of people. So safe to say I'm at your level of worship of Brené Brown there.
Tell me about Social Work Sorted. So explain what you're trying to do through this organisation that you've set up for other social workers. What do you do, and how does it help them?
So I started Social Work Sorted as a bit of a platform for education for newly qualified social workers off the back of the pandemic, really, seeing that social workers were coming out qualified on paper, but having had 2 years of either studying or doing their newly qualified year in a pandemic where practice was very different. As I've talked about, it was reactive, it was crisis. You couldn't have the time with people. And so I was seeing in my job new social workers who didn't have the skills for practice because they hadn't been in an office. So they hadn't picked up on the phone calls that we make. They didn't know when to hang up the phone when someone might be being abusive to them or it's getting too much. They didn't know how to do a home visit because they'd been seeing people on the doorstep because of COVID. So I started to try and break those things down. And as it just kind of grew organically. And I think I probably didn't realize how needed it was for this gap between what's the theory that I learned at university, but how is that actually put into practice? And as it grew, I started picking up on the things that people needed a little bit more and honing in on those sort of how-tos, and not with the intention of replacing the academic knowledge or the theory or the research, but like I said, with the intention of making something that's accessible. So if you don't have time in your day to access that, let what I do be a tiny reminder that might make things a little bit better. And yeah, it's grown really. And I always wanted to go into training. It's always something that I did as part of my job. And I suppose through Social Work Sorted, it's grown into that really, and I've been able to offer more specific training either around confidence or communication skills or direct work and assessment skills. And yeah, I've loved it. And the nicest bit is when I have new social workers saying thank you, or that's really helped, or I felt like that and I didn't think anyone else felt like that. And yeah, it's been amazing and nice to tap into what's going on for new social workers and how they can be helped, because there's so many out there who are just trying to sort of keep the head above water without any flow underneath. So
and is that
trying to be a bit of a float, I guess.
The amazing work that you do within Social Work Sorted, does that keep you going?
Yeah, definitely. I think like I said, very recently moved out of frontline practice, still within safeguarding and child protection, but not as direct. And I think Social Work Sorted has been a massive motivation for me. It was always something I did alongside work, and the job that I do is still my priority because that's the children and families that I'm working with. But yeah, it keeps me going because I know that it's needed and I know that it's helping. And I sort of think if I write something that 10 social workers read in a day, and then they go out to work and 10 families that they work with might benefit from the way they've responded to something or the way they've listened or the piece of work that they've done, that for me is really exciting, that from one thing that I do, it might just span out a little bit. And yeah, maybe the people higher and higher will start to listen, because I try and be as rooted in what's happening for new social workers as possible. So
if people want to become more involved in the community that they live within, how can we as a collective, do you think, impact each other in a positive way? Let me rephrase that a little bit. Using our caring, empathic, compassionate selves, because I know there's many people out there that feel like they want to do more within their communities, but don't know how to. What can we do? Are there ways that we can volunteer? Are there things that we can do within schools, within nurseries, within friendship groups that can protect us from the problems and everything else that could be there?
Yeah, I would say probably in terms of volunteering or working in communities, tapping into what's already there, because there's so much already there in terms of local communities. And if you don't know, it's probably just that you don't know rather than it's not there or doesn't exist already. So instead of starting new things or new initiatives, which I think sometimes people want to do, there's probably an initiative already existing. And just, I suppose at the moment it's food banks or clothing banks or collections for kind of refugees, all those things I would say. And I think just starting small and trying to do things locally is the best way, because sometimes we want to make this big massive change, but it only happens in
on a granular
tiny
level.
Little moments again, I suppose. So yeah, definitely. So I think just trying to do what you can as locally as you can is the way that things start building, or that connection starts building.
If you could choose, how would you want people to see social work and social workers?
That's quite difficult, because I think first, social work as a profession in terms of statutory social work would have to change for people to see that change. It would have to go back to communities and support and early intervention, and social workers being able to be one-on-one with families and not have the red tape and the paperwork. But I think when I am working with families, my hope is that they just see me as another human who is trying to do their job and do their best, and as someone who is also not completely autonomous. So, and I think a lot of social workers, and maybe don't always say it because it might not be professional to say, but want to say, this isn't my decision, but I'm just the face of the organisation, and this isn't something that's come from me, but I'm the one delivering the news, and this isn't really what I want, but there's been lots of different choices that have been made outside of my control. So I suppose seeing social workers as individuals, and I guess that's what families would want as well, and children would want, instead of seeing kind of your family's experiencing this, so this must be what is happening. Just
a wider
taking people
perspective and a
for who they are, really.
Approach. Amazing. Thanks so much, Vicki, for coming on and talking to me today. Where can people find more of your stuff, and where can they contact you if they want to tap into the resources that you have? Okay, well, thank you for having me, first of all. It's been really nice. It's been really nice to think about things to a non-social work audience, because everything I do is to a social work audience. About social work and social workers, other than what I see on your content and through what you share. So, and if I'm not really aware of what happens, and I like to think I'm quite switched on with stuff, then I know that there's going to be an awful lot of other people who only have a normal perspective, the things that they might read or see or hear. And it was important for me that people get another perspective from somebody who's actually doing the work and can share how that might be impacting. So, so where can people find your stuff, Vicki? Where can they contact you? So I am on Instagram at Social Work Sorted. That's probably where I post the majority of things. I have a podcast, which is Social Work Sorted, the podcast, which is on Apple and Spotify. And I have some really good social work related guests on that as well. And I have a website, socialworksorted.com. Thank you so much, any of those Vicki. I really appreciate you coming today.